Australia could move to formally recognise a Palestinian state in the wake of today's cabinet meeting here in Canberra. Let's bring in Trudy McIntosh. And the government's been inching towards this for many weeks now.
Yeah, we've been seeing these signals out of the Albanese government, Kieran, that this is where things are headed. If you needed any more confirmation of that, it was the Prime Minister on Saturday standing there during his trip to New Zealand, repeating that language, that it's a matter of when, not if, on this question of a Palestinian state. We've also seen that coordinated diplomacy ramp up in the last week too, speaking to a series of like-minded world leaders who have already taken this step, putting preconditions on when they would formally recognise a Palestinian state, but certainly momentum is building towards this UN General Assembly meeting being held in September. But that coordinated pressure hasn't seemed to shift the dial when it comes to the response of Benjamin Netanyahu and his government in Israel. We saw that on Friday with the threat to move in further in terms of a military occupation into Gaza City. And then overnight, the Israeli Prime Minister pushing back on countries like Australia explicitly going down this path of Palestinian recognition. He argues that if Australia were put in a similar position faced with a terror threat on its border, that it would be acting in the same way.
To have European countries and Australia march into that, rabbit hole, just like that, fall right into it, and buy this canard is disappointing, and I think it's actually shameful. But it's not going to change our position. Those who say that Israel has a right to defend itself are also saying, but don't exercise that right. They know what they would do if right next to Melbourne or right next to Sydney, you had this horrific attacks. I think you would do it, at least what we're doing.
That's a sovereign decision for Australia to make. We're not making it based on what other countries may be seeking to do themselves or not doing. But we've always been very clear that there has to be a release of hostages and that Hamas cannot be involved in any ongoing governance of Palestine. And so I don't see any way in which Australia's position can be seen to be encouraging of Hamas in any way.
Matt Keogh there, the Minister for Veterans Affairs, speaking in Perth in the last hour, obviously a member of the Outer Ministry, so not part of the formal cabinet meeting that's taking place here in Canberra. We've also seen reaction today from New South Wales Premier Chris Minns. I wanted to bring you this. State premiers obviously don't have a big influence on this debate, but he publicly has thrown his weight behind the push to recognise a Palestinian state.
I'll leave the timing and conditions to the federal government. It's important that they're in a position to make that decision. But as somebody who, like a lot of people around the world, ultimately believe a two-state solution is the only way of having a permanent, long-term, just peace in the Middle East, that necessarily means that I support a Palestinian state.
The government, when it is announced, obviously will have conditions around it, like Hamas can't be involved in any future Palestinian state as part of the government of a future state. And it's similar sort of conditions to what we've heard from other leaders like Keir Starmer. Yeah,
as you're saying, this is a preconditions being set. We've seen it from the case of the UK, Canada, in terms of their path towards recognition. And that reiteration, we saw it from Matt Keogh there, but it comes every time this question comes up, that Hamas can't have a, quote, governance role in a future Palestinian state. I also thought it's worth mentioning that statement we saw at the weekend from Foreign Minister Penny Wong in coordination with our partners, speaking about the central role that the Palestinian Authority will have in governing Gaza down the track, even though from Israel's perspective, they say the PA can't have any role. So that is a point of tension there. And don't forget, the Prime Minister spoke to the Palestinian Authority president last week and is planning to meet him at the UN as well. Interesting comments, though, from the Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke on Sunday Agenda yesterday when asked about this tension about Hamas not having any leadership role. He points to examples in other cases where there can be a role for a terror group in coordinating some part of a state, and you can continue to recognise the legitimacy of that state. Have a look.
There have frequently been countries where part of that nation has been occupied by a terrorist group, and we haven't ceased to recognise the country. Both Syria and Iraq had a long period where parts of those countries were being occupied and realistically controlled by ISIS.
It's worth remembering if we go down this path, as we expect of Australia joining this push to recognise Palestine, Kieran, it's largely symbolic from our perspective. Our government's under no illusion that this would be a fundamental game changer on the ground in terms of Australia joining the push. The biggest lever here comes from the United States. The open question is how much President Donald Trump wants to put that leverage on Bibi Netanyahu directly. And on this question of a Palestinian state, it doesn't seem forthcoming.
And it's interesting you raise that because it was on my mind as to where this goes next for Australia after the announcement. And then you think a month ahead to the UN, and the Prime Minister's got to navigate that meeting with Donald Trump, whether it be on this issue at the White House or at the UN. This will come up. I just wonder... Donald Trump's had his own patience tested by Benjamin Netanyahu as well.
And he continues to point out that he wants to see more aid get into Gaza. There is always a little tension between Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump. In terms of the Australian-US dialogue, that face-to-face diplomacy, I wonder how much prominence this issue would have. We have bigger issues we want to raise, including shoring up AUKUS, the tariffs. So, yes, it would likely get a mention in a bilateral meeting, but I can't imagine it's the most prominent discussion that those two world leaders would have.
On those commitments in New York, most of it would be around the General Assembly, and a lot of that Australia would be in lockstep with the international community if they shifted.
And we have seen since, before the last election, Australia slowly shifting its position at the United Nations on a whole series of these key votes, no longer voting in lockstep with the United States. That has continued to be something we've seen. And if we do recognise Palestine today and this comes up as a matter at the UN General Assembly, we'd likely once again vote in a separate way to the US.
Yeah, and with a majority, it doesn't please all the friends of Israel on that, but that is certainly where the numbers are. Trudy McIntosh, thank you.